This podcast is certified fresh. Freshmediaworks.com.
Looking to boost your company's marketing? Look no further than Fresh MediaWorks. Podcasting is the best way to promote your brand and increase your customer base. You can create your own show, be a guest on other podcasts, or advertise on existing podcasts to reach a valuable audience. Don't wait. Start elevating your marketing game today with Fresh MediaWorks. Call now, 713-269-4620, or find us online at freshmediaworks.com/podcasting.
Coaches Wednesday Weekly Buzz. I'm Bob Bertucci with fellow master coaches Tom Hibert and Jim Stone. Mick Haley is sailing the seven seas, so he's somewhere in South America at this point, and we're not able to have him on for this episode. But today we got a special treat for you as we dive into the dynamic world of college athletics and professional volleyball. Our first guest is a true authority on the rapidly evolving landscape of college athletics, specializing in the area of name, image, and likeness, NIL deals. So please welcome Bill Carter to the show.
Thanks, Bob. It's really great to be here. Great to be back.
Yeah, it is great to have you back, Bill, and we have a lot to cover. So let's jump right into some of the pressing questions about NIL. And I'm going to start it off with a question that I think everybody's always interested in hearing about, is how much NIL money is currently being paid to college quarterbacks, top scoring basketball players, women's volleyball players. That's particularly interesting for our listeners.
Yeah. So like most of NIL, Bob, like most aspects of NIL, it's a little bit confusing in that because we don't have a centralized database of really any NIL data, and certainly not compensation data. In other words, it's not really being tracked, and what little is being tracked, it could be as little as 30% of all deals might be actually being tracked and therefore provided to compliance offices at the university level. We don't have a lot of good information. And so that's number one. Number two is that when you and I and your listeners read a news article and it says something in the headline that so-and-so coming out of high school, it's being reported that he's being offered a $1 million contract or a $5 million contract or a $7 million contract from a collective, from an NIL collective, that creates even more confusion because we don't necessarily see, first of all, we don't know if that's accurate because there's no way to verify it. And number two, it's difficult to know what's actually embedded in that NIL agreement. In other words, what is that student athlete agreeing to do? We call those NIL activities. What NIL activities is that student athlete agreeing to do for that compensation? So it becomes very murky. Let me sort of take it in a slightly different direction. What we do have okay data on is the compensation per NIL activity. And what we think we know is that many of the Power 5 quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, so the Power 5, the upper echelon of college football, they're being paid somewhere in the neighborhood of, on the low end, maybe $3,000 per NIL activity, and on the high end, maybe $10,000 per NIL activity. So making an appearance, signing an autograph, doing an autograph session, not signing one autograph, doing a short social media campaign, those sorts of things. And of course, if you're doing those a number of times, then the compensation is adding up, and your compensation, if you're a football player at a Power 5 institution, is probably very high. It's probably well over $100,000 a year. But these gigantic deals that we see being reported, it's difficult to sort of pull them in and make them make a lot of sense of them. So the second thing, and I realize my first answer here is a long one, but the second thing is I just want to touch on the volleyball aspect. So all the same things I just said about difficult to track applies to every sport, including volleyball. But here's what we think we know. The very top of the NIL, we'll call them the NIL athletes in volleyball, which seem to be dominated by University of Texas and University of Nebraska athletes, appear to have the potential to be earning $60,000 or $70,000 a year in NIL income. And that's Maddie Skinner, Alexi Rodriguez, Harper Murray. Again, we can't verify that that's what they've made, but we can sort of read the tea leaves and see what the opportunities are for athletes at that level. Now, the last thing I'll say is that the sort of rank and file, but still high level Division I volleyball player is probably more in the range of $100 to $500 per NIL activity. So the Power 5 quarterback, that range I just said, probably in the $3,000 to $10,000 range. For the volleyball player, probably in the $100 to $500 range. Again, per activity. Could be an autograph, a social post, an appearance, etc.
So, Bill, Tom Hibert, we hear a lot about, from a coach's standpoint, how this is being used in recruiting, when in fact it's, the NCAA says it's not supposed to be used as an enticement. What are you hearing along those lines, and how is that happening?
Yeah, so as you just indicated, the NCAA guidelines or policy, however you want to position it, is pretty clear on this one, which is that NIL is not to be used as an inducement. And inducements happen when a coaching staff is trying to recruit a high school student athlete onto campus for the first time. An inducement can happen by way of the transfer portal. So a college student athlete's already in the transfer portal. They've decided that they want to change universities, and they potentially are being induced to go to University X versus University Y because of an NIL opportunity that's been communicated to them. And then there's another kind of inducement, which I guess doesn't, other people don't use it to apply to this, but I do in this scenario, which is an inducement to stay, right? So we talk, for the first time ever, you hear coaches talking about retaining players, player retention. So that's keeping the roster, the current roster, intact. And it's, to me, and this is my opinion, I'm one of many voices, but my opinion is, if you are induced by NIL to stay on a roster, that also fits within that category, which is not supposed to be happening. So the NIL deals that you're referencing, Tom, are mainly being created and communicated to student athletes through the NIL collectives. And NIL collectives, as you know, are third parties, and they are only quasi-associated with the university. They're not within the athletic department. They're not university employees. So while, in my opinion, the university does bear some responsibility for the actions of the collective, the collectives are certainly walking a fine line, and they are inducing student athletes in all three scenarios that I just described. And, it's as plain as day. This is not, it's not debatable what's happening. It's no different than you standing on the street right now, and you and I standing out there and saying, "Well, the speed limit's 25." We know when cars are going 40. Like it doesn't, it's obvious, right? This is very obvious that inducements are happening.
Hey, Bill, this is Jim. And first of all, thanks for joining us today and lending your expertise, because this is a fuzzy area that we're talking about. And, kind of a case in point, I read recently where the NC2A was concerned about Tennessee football recruiting tactics using NIL and collectives as an inducement. And then the very next day, I just read this morning where the Attorney General of Tennessee is suing the NC2A for restricting the athletes, their commercial use of their name, image, and likeness. So I think everybody, it seems like the coaches feel there's got to be some guardrails put in, but every time the NC2A puts in guardrails, it seems like they're going to lose in court. Can you, given your background, is there some way the NC2A can put some parameters that would survive in court that you think is reasonable for the athletes, but also reasonable for the institutions and the NC2A?
Well, let me start with this part, Jim, which is, like everyone who is paying attention to NIL, including the three of you, I've read the articles about the University of Tennessee, and I don't necessarily have any specific comment about that scenario, not because I'm trying to sort of skirt around it, but rather because we don't know the whole story yet. In other words, we won't know the whole story necessarily until there's a full NCAA investigation, until the University of Tennessee lays out their rebuttal, maybe until this goes to court, et cetera, et cetera. But I will say that, and just to put a fine point on something that you just said, the reason you're bringing it up and the reason I think it's part of our discussion right now is that the NCAA has clearly decided that they're going to test their authority, that you have all these member schools, and it's probably close to 100% of them, member institutions that make up the NCAA, asking for guidance, asking for rules and guardrails. And part of that, again, my opinion, part of that is enforcement. There's no reason to have a rule if you're not going to enforce it. And so the universities asked for guardrails more than they had on, more than they had in the summer of 2021. And now there's starting to be enforcement. First with issues at Florida State, and now at Tennessee. And certainly these will not be the last two. And now the same member schools who I think love the idea of guardrails in theory may not like very much the enforcement action that I think the NCAA has to take, or they shouldn't have bothered with the rules. So in terms of the legal maneuvering, I think what you're saying is said, more eloquently than I probably could have said it right off the bat, which is, frankly, what does the NCAA have to do that's not going to end up in court and not be tested because one member institution just doesn't like the outcome or doesn't like the action that the NCAA has taken? And unfortunately, I don't think this is going to end. I think this is going to happen over and over and over in court. The NCAA will be tested, and it may have to be tested a dozen times before there's actual change or agreement as to what the member schools are going to adjust to and agree to. And I think that probably is part of the NCAA's mistake, is that they clearly don't have everybody on board in terms of what the rules and regulations are going to be. Because again, part of that would be if we, the NCAA, find an infraction, we're going to enforce it, and you as member schools agreed to it. So you're not going to sue us. So again, I know I'm being long-winded. I just want to make one other point, which is that one of the very few things that really gets under my skin about how chaotic NIL is, not much of it gets under my skin. I think it's all going to work out in the long run. But I really can't stand the political maneuvering, the state legislatures, senators, congressmen, maneuvering and getting into the fight on behalf of their public institutions, frankly, because they're trying to act like fans and not act like elected politicians. I think we've seen it in Missouri. We've now seen it in Tennessee. I think we have seen it actually already in Florida. I think it's complete nonsense. That's not what you were elected to do. You're elected to fix problems, not rile up the fan base of your public university.
Well, Bill, on the kind of in the same light, where do you see, if you had a crystal ball, where do you see NIL headed in the future? And is it sustainable?
I think it's sustainable, Bob, but it's going to look a lot different. It may look similar to what we have for the next 2 years, and I'm just guessing there, but I think in 3 years, if the four of us come back together in 4 years, it's going to look much different. And the way that I look at it is, on day one, there was really only one definition of NIL, and that was sort of what we'll call sort of the purest form of NIL. It was going to be a student athlete working on behalf of a brand or a business to promote that brand's products or services in exchange for compensation. Promotion in exchange for compensation. That's all it was going to be. Then very quickly, within the first, say, 6 months, collectives were added to the mix and they became part of the definition. So now there's two kinds of NIL, right? There's the brand or sort of free market NIL that I just described. There's the collective NIL, which is certainly not free market, right? There's no competition there except for collective to collective. But it actually, if the collective on a particular campus is incentivized to actually pay as much as possible to a student athlete, like it's the opposite of free market. And so those two things have changed. That has now changed the definition. And then I think we're going to get a third thing, which again, within 3 years, I think will happen. That this is my crystal ball. And this is not new, but I'm guessing at the time frame, which is, I think ultimately what NCAA President Charlie Baker stated in a memo the first week of this past December about a new subdivision of the most resourced athletic departments, otherwise known as the richest athletic departments. He says there'll be 100 that might peel off and then pay student athletes directly for the use of their name, image, and likeness. So pay the university athletic department paying the student athlete directly for their NIL. I don't think there's 100 of those schools. I think there might be 60 of them, but that's in the weeds. The crystal ball answer I'm giving you is in 3 years, there's a new subdivision and those schools are paying student athletes directly for their NIL. So now there's three definitions of NIL at that point.
Okay.
So
Tom, you have a question on collective.
Yeah, I do. And I'm involved, so in the collective at Colorado State University.
Right.
And it's funny because you start talking to people who are actually working within the collectives and they say things like, they got to outlaw collectives. You know what I mean? Because you look into the future and you're like, this is going to be impossible to sustain for a program like Colorado State University. But I'd like you to just talk about how collectives work, the ones that you've seen, and what student athletes have to do as proof of service for getting money from a collective? Just kind of explain that to our listeners.
Yeah, it's a great question. By the way, Colorado State might be a really interesting case study. So again, if we're having this conversation in 3 years, is a Colorado State one of those top 100 universities? I certainly think so. If it goes to 60, if a Colorado State, if a University of Vermont, if a Gonzaga, if they choose to sort of up their game, so to speak, and try to get into that upper echelon, I don't know. I don't know who's got this. I don't know if those schools have the stomach for that, right? But so anyway, Colorado State, very interesting that you bring them up. So how do collectives work? Well, at the very sort of like baseline for the listeners, about 99% of collectives are launched by a single wealthy booster or a small group of wealthy boosters who have ties to the university, obviously as alumni and probably closer ties to the athletic department. They've probably been financial supporters of athletics for years and years, and they're season ticket holders and go to all that, the university's events and so forth. And so now that these individuals are allowed to participate in NIL, the way that some of them choose to do it is to create a business entity. Most of them are for-profit ventures. Some collectives have been set up as nonprofits, and I think we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But they're a business entity whose mission is to essentially raise money, whether it's through other boosters or through commercial activities or developing relationships with local businesses or brands, and almost acting as an agency, and then creating NIL opportunities so that money can get into the hands of the student athletes that they're trying to support. That's sort of at its most basic level why collectives have sprung up. There are about 200 of them. Just to give you a frame of reference to your listeners, there's about 300 Division I athletic programs. So about 2/3 have a collective that are supporting them. And that's, in a nutshell, that's what collectives are here to do. And Tom, sorry, I'm now remembering the second part of your question, which is, sort of what does this mean to athletes, reporting, and so forth. So in theory, the student athlete doesn't really need to behave any differently engaging with a collective as she or he does versus if they were to do an NIL deal with the local pizza place in the college town. There's really no difference, right? So if a local pizza joint wants to spend $500 having a student athlete post on their social media accounts 2 times a week for 3 months or during a season, they pay that student athlete the $500. The student athlete signs a contract. The contract, a copy of it goes to the compliance office, and the pizza place probably just, and it's pretty obvious with social media, right? Because it's public, but the pizza place just says, okay, I'm going to send you a check every week once I get proof that you have completed the NIL activity. And that proof usually comes in literally just a screenshot of the social media post, right? And so in theory, the collective is not operating any differently. They're operating at a different scale, because there could be a couple of dozen athletes that are associated with the collective, or maybe 150 athletes because they brought in every scholarship football player and a host of other athletes at the university. But in theory, there's not really any difference in terms of what the student athlete is expected to do. They're expected to perform NIL activity in exchange for compensation.
Hey, Bill, this is Jim. And staying with collectives, for another moment, and also the subdivisions and some proposals by the new NC2A president, Charlie Baker. One of those things is you have more expertise than I, so I hope I'm phrasing this correctly. He'd like to bring NIL and collectives underneath the umbrella of athletic departments and universities, as opposed to collectives operating independently outside the university. Do you have an opinion one way or the other in terms of what's going to be best for, I guess, the athlete, but also from an NC2A perspective, to streamline and clean up the process?
So, Jim, one thing that's really interesting is think of how quickly things have changed on this timeline. When we go back to summer 2021, when NIL became a reality, and within a couple of weeks, or even really before, we knew there were going to be these things called collectives, and they were beginning. The discussion was already out there that they were going to be created by boosters, and the sort of party line at the time from the NCAA and from institution to institution was everybody needs to keep these collectives at a distance. They don't, they're not part of the athletic department. They're operating as third parties, and we need to keep our distance and remain separated. And then about a year and a half passes, and I think some smart Power 5 athletic directors began to voice the problem with that, which is if you leave collectives out on an island, and these collectives are run by generally business people with no background in college athletics, and frankly, almost no understanding of NCAA guidelines on anything from recruiting to across the board. The list is too long to mention here. If you leave them out on an island, you're asking for mistakes to happen. So those athletic directors really, I think, behind the scenes lobbied for a closer connection, to be able to communicate more openly with the collective that was trying to support their athletic department, not just because the support was probably going to be greater, but because less mistakes were going to be made. And so now what you're suggesting, which I think will become a reality to a point, is that particularly when we get to the point, it's going to happen, when we get to the point that there's an additional subdivision, and that subdivision is paying student athletes directly out of athletic department funds, the question becomes, where are those funds going to come from? And it makes the most sense, because collectives have been out there raising money for this exact purpose, that part or all of those staffs, those collective staffs, might be brought in-house inside the athletic department. So you can make an argument either way. That's a terrible idea. These are not college athletics, people with college athletics experience, and we'll do better using our own internal resources to raise revenue and pay student athletes for their NIL. Or you can make the argument, well, they've already been doing it for a year or 2 years or 3 years in some cases. So let's just bring them in, and maybe we'll have a leg up in the process. But so I think the reality is that some version of it is going to happen. I don't see a scenario in which if a Power 5 university becomes part of this new subdivision and is paying their student athletes, I don't see a scenario in which they just completely walk away and turn their back on the collective that's been essentially serving in that capacity up to this point.
Bill, you mentioned nonprofit and profit collectives. Can you explain that a little bit? Because I can't see how there's any profit being made. They're just giving money out, unless collecting the money is part of the profit.
Yeah. So I'm not I'm not an accountant and I'm not a tax attorney, but I will, I'll sort of explain it this way. So, a lot of us, I don't know if there are any tax attorneys or accountants among the group here. I don't know Jim and Tom's background, but I will say that, there is a difference between being a nonprofit and having tax exempt status, right? And so the idea initially, Bob, was say there's 200 collectives, only about 20 or 30 were created as nonprofits, okay? And so they did that with the intent to raise money from donors and be able to provide a tax reduction opportunity for that donor in the way that donor might have been giving to the university or athletic department in the past, and being able to take a certain percentage of that donation off of their tax bill come April 15th. That was their intent. The IRS stepped in about 6 months ago and basically published a memo that said that that's not that collectives are not serving any sort of purpose that would establish them as a tax exempt organization. So no donor is going to be able to claim that they made a donation and be able to reduce their tax bill. That's sort of been set in stone now by the IRS, and essentially the IRS saying, listen, you don't serve a tax exempt purpose. You're essentially an agent who's collecting money from one source and creating a business scenario that gets money into the hands of student athletes. That's not for tax. That's not a tax exempt purpose. So you can call yourself a nonprofit, but you're not going to be tax exempt.
I feel like we ought to jump ahead, Bill, and talk about some of the things that are part of your expertise. So can you talk about the top 3 things a collegiate volleyball player should do in order to grow their brand and sponsorship potential?
Yeah, I'll start off by saying that every athlete, every volleyball player in this case, like you have to accept the fact that you're not starting from square one. You have a personal brand. We all do, right? We have a personal brand, or they have a personal brand because they've had some visibility on them since they were a high school or club player. They've had news coverage. They've been on social media. Their parents and friends and family and other fans of the program that they were in. They've had all of those eyes on them. And if you were to survey lots of individuals around a student athlete and you were to ask them, give me 3 or 4 words that come to mind when I say this athlete's name, and they were to tell you those 3 or 4 words, like that is the start of that individual's brand. So they already have a brand. And so then the question then becomes, I think, what do they want to do to establish or evolve their brand so that they have better NIL opportunities? And so I think the first thing they have to do is determine, what are the 1, maybe 2, but I like to stick with 1. What's the one thing that student athlete wants to be associated with in addition to playing the sport? The sport cannot be the brand. There's tens of thousands of volleyball players. There's 550,000 student athletes. There's 190,000 Division I athletes. That's not the differentiator. You've got to have a brand associated with some core aspect of your being that you want to talk about and put out into the world. It can be, as an example, it can be about leadership or mental health or nutrition or a particular social cause. All of those things are an excellent sort of starting point or backbone to creating a personal brand. I like to say to student athletes, if you can't think of something right now, or you have a lot of things running through your head, what that could be, ask yourself this question. What could you get up and talk about in a room right now to 10 people for 20 minutes straight without notes? You have to stand up right now and talk about it for 20 minutes. If you can do that, you're probably pretty passionate about that topic, and that's probably something that you ought to lean towards. So let's just say that it's mental health. Then the next stage in developing your brand is consistency. Consistency on social media, consistency in interviews, consistency every opportunity there is a reasonable, relevant opportunity to talk about mental health and its importance to you. You've got to talk about it. And either that's the direction you go in creating NIL partnerships, or better yet, because you're talking about it, that's the visibility you bring to yourself. And those are the potential partners that come to you. So a lot of it is about identifying what it is you want to be associated with. And then number two is being really, really consistent about that being your message and talking about it as frequently as you can.
Bill, can you give us an example of a collegiate player who has successfully capitalized on his or her personal brand and NIL opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, I think one athlete that's done a really good job with their brand is the UCLA quarterback Chase Griffin. Like if you look at what Chase has done, he sort of decided that he's going to be a student athlete voice in NIL. So in other words, if I had asked him the question, what can you get up and talk about for 20 minutes straight? He wouldn't have said mental health or leadership or nutrition, though maybe he could talk about those things too. He very early on wanted to and has successfully decided to be a student athlete advocate for NIL. And he has really done the work. I mean, that's part of it too, right? He knows as much or more about the details of NIL than I suspect most athletic administrators know at D1 universities. I mean, he's really put in the work. And now what you see is when he's posting on social media, it's not about all the other stuff it could be about. It's about really the business and advocacy of NIL from a student athlete perspective.
Hey, Bill, as I think this might be a wrap-up question because we're running short on time, and we certainly appreciate the time you've devoted here. And the three of us are outside the coaching world right now, but is there a coach out there that has done a really good job of helping their athletes in the NIL world? And what did they do, or what can coaches do to facilitate the process and make sure the athlete is up to speed on the rules and the responsibilities and that type of thing?
Gosh, I'm gonna name a name here in a second, and I want to just be clear that there's no formal relationship between the two of us, because it wouldn't be fair to him, and I don't want anybody to think that I'm attaching myself to a name in any sort of official capacity, because that's not the case. But the head lacrosse coach at Notre Dame is a guy named Kevin Corcoran. And not coincidentally, Notre Dame is the current men's lacrosse national champion. They won their first national championship this past spring. Coach Corcoran's been there a long time. I I think, well over 20 years, been the head coach there. And they've had a hugely successful program there, been in multiple Final Fours. I think they've been in one other championship game and finally broke through and won the national championship. And here's why I use him as an example. I don't know what he does day to day related to NIL. I suspect it's not a major part of what he thinks about. But what I've always appreciated about him, and I can give you lots of detail, which I'll leave out right now, but what I've really always appreciated about him is that he is very much in tune with NIL realities. He did not turn his back on NIL and say, it's not my problem. I don't agree with it, or, I don't even know how he feels about NIL in today's collegiate sports, collegiate athletics environment. But I do know, because I can see with my own eyes, that he is deeply invested in learning. And that's really the headline. I shouldn't have buried the headline. I really appreciate coaches that, whether they support NIL or they don't support NIL personally, that they look at it as part of the modern evolution of college sports, and they become learners of what NIL is and then determine how they're going to apply it to their own programs. So Coach Corcoran at Notre Dame, a bunch of others, but he's just somebody who comes to mind.
Bill, we all want to thank you for coming on the show again and really, giving us some real insights into this NIL and helping our coaches that are listening and viewing the show today. And I hope you'll agree to come back again as this NIL continues to develop. I know you're doing a lot with your courses and your NIL MBA program. Thank you for doing that. It's great to have somebody out there that we can use as a resource.
Bob, thanks for having me. Jim and Tom, good to see you again. Count me in for visit number 3 whenever you need me.
All right. Thanks, Bill. All right, let's take a minute to hear from our friends and sponsor at SNA Sports Group about their outstanding volleyball net systems.
When you're talking about volleyball equipment, Collegiate 4000 is our benchmark, and it's our most popular system. At 22 and 27 pounds for the post weight, it's very easy to carry around. And I've seen middle schools as well as high school teams be able to set it up in under 5 minutes consistently. It uses our international net, which is a really unique net design. It doesn't slide back and forth on the top and bottom ropes. You actually hook the 4 points up, tighten everything up, and you're ready to play. Regardless of your sleeve size, whether they're 4-inch, 3.5, or 3-inch, we can modify our posts to fit that. They'll drop right in with a lifetime warranty on the post and a lifetime warranty on the winch. We're covering all of the real major components of the net system. We have infinite net height adjustability on the slide rail, from men's height all the way down to tennis if needed. And it's also infinitely upgradable. You don't really have to buy posts again. You can always just upgrade the rails and keep on going with whatever new technology we come out with. So if you're looking for a lightweight and versatile net system that's a snap to set up, I wouldn't look any further than the Collegiate. If you're interested, please give me a call. I'd love to talk with you.
Well, welcome back, everyone. We had an insightful conversation about NIL, but the excitement doesn't end there. Now, let's shift our focus to the thrilling world of professional women's volleyball. Joining us for the Buzz Reaction segment of our show is none other than Jen Spicher, Executive Director of the Pro Volleyball Federation. Welcome back again, Jen. We're glad you're here.
First week is in the books. We had games Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of last week. We had over 24,700 paid attendance for 3 matches. That's an average of 8,200 plus. We had another 230,000 people watch our YouTube streams since then and watched the matches on YouTube. So obviously, the first 3 matches were a huge hit. We're super excited about week 2. I'm actually in Atlanta, staying at the Gas South District area, waiting for that match to take place tomorrow night when the Atlanta Vibe hosts the San Diego Mojo. You can get the matches on our YouTube channel, the Pro Volleyball Federation YouTube channel. We do have a longer-term deal coming along with Stadium and Bally's, where all the matches will be streamed, and Stadium will be a national broadcast. And then, of course, we signed our deal with CBS. They're going to be producing 10 matches towards the beginning of April, and for the rest of the year, they're going to wait until after the NCAA, and of course, they're going to host our championship weekend. What did I think about the crowd and the attendance? It's been absolutely a blast. I was in Omaha. There were just under 12,000 people in Omaha. We knew that they were going to show up and show out, and they certainly did. And what a game that was. It was a 5-set thriller that went 15-13 in the 5th. And then we went on to Columbia, or to Grand Rapids. They sold out at 7,805. The Grand Rapids Rise beat the Columbus Fury in 3, but I will say Coach Perez was missing 3 of his stars. He did not have Megan Courtney with him. She unfortunately was ill. Asia O'Neal and Jenna Rosenthal did not play. So I think that that's a sleeper team for sure. And then I will tell you, I was in Orlando. That crowd was eclectic. They were unbelievable. And I will also say that I was really impressed with Amy Pauley and her Orlando Valkyries. That team is a sleeper team, and people need to watch out for them. As far as the crowds go, a lot of the Orlando and the Grand Rapids crowds were kids, lots of volleyball players, lots of very fun, fanatic volleyball players. And I think that our crowds are only going to get larger as our product continues to sell itself. The matches were extremely competitive, as you know. Orlando also went 15-12 in the 5th set, a very competitive match. Both that match and the Omaha match could have gone either way. But we had a super successful week, and we're really stoked to bring it to their home opener in Atlanta tomorrow night. I think the media coverage has been unbelievable. I believe Omaha had over 150 media credentials that were given out. I've had a slew of requests for radio and TV here in Atlanta. When I was in Omaha, I think I did 5 TV spots and 6 radio spots. NPR covered it. CNN World Sports covered it. We've had a lot. AP, Associated Press, covered it. There was an article in USA Today. It's volleyball's having a moment. Nebraska volleyball's having a moment. College volleyball's having a moment. And now Pro Volleyball Federation is having a moment. And it's been all kinds of fun, guys. Rosters currently are 14 active players and 2 practice players. Each team has, I believe, 2 internationals, and I believe each team has the internationals here. The practice players have to be college drafted eligible. So some of them may have been drafted. I don't know if you know this, Bob, but we had a draft in December. We had 35 players drafted, 5 rounds of 7 each, and 30 of the 35 players signed our contracts and showed up to play for Pro Volleyball Federation this year. We had a couple go to Europe, and then we had a couple that didn't play due to school and some surgeries. So we're super excited about that. We do have a couple of athletes currently playing in China, 3 to be exact. And as soon as they're done, they will be joining their teams and joining those active rosters. I know you wanted to talk a little bit about players that are going to be done. I actually just talked to Anna Stevenson Hall, Stevie, who's over and playing at A1 for Casa Major, I think. I think she said her last day is like March 30th. And she said that some of the players there were highly considering coming back and playing in April and May. If you look at our season, April 1st, we still have about 12 games, about half of our season left. And so it's very possible that international players, American women playing internationally could come back and play in our league if they so chose. That would be between them and the coaches.
Well, we're also wondering a little bit about just contracts in general, whether 1-year contracts or, and when does a team, how long do they retain their rights?
The length of contracts, these contracts are going to end in July, but we've already re-upped many of our athletes for 2025 because they've seen the product. they're having all kinds of fun playing in that type of an environment and really realizing that, this is real pro volleyball. You've got home rivalries, you've got away rivalries, you've got a championship that's going to pay out $1 million to the winning team. And so we've got all kinds of athletes re-upping for the 2025 season. We do have new franchises for next year. Kansas City's going to play. Dallas is going to play. Indianapolis is going to play. All three of those markets are in the final throes of hiring their coaches. And then the coaches are going to go to work, and they're going to be looking for their staffs of players, both international and otherwise. And then I expect we'll have a draft again around the same time last year. And as you know, Bob and Jim and Tom, the graduating class coming out of the NCAA is very, very strong. So I expect we'll have a number of athletes that are going to be excited about joining the Pro Volleyball Federation because they've had a chance to witness it in action and see what a special product on the floor this really is.
Well, Jen, I'd really like to thank you very much for coming on. All right, so that we can have you on next week and talk a little bit more interactively, all right, and have a conversation about the Pro Volleyball Federation and all the great things that we've seen this first week. We'll talk a little bit about next week.
Thanks, Jen.
All right, thank you, Jen. That concludes another interesting episode of MasterCoaches Wednesday Weekly Buzz. All right, I'd like to thank Bill Carter and Jen for coming on. Also, our sponsor, NSA Sports Group. All right, and don't forget to follow us on social media and behind-the-scenes content that we'll have through our social media. All right, until next week, from Bob, Tom, and Jim, we're signing off, and stay buzzing.